beauty of our nation is that it was founded on the principles of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment created such a freedom for all of us to experience. And so summertime always is, there's the, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I have no idea how to work this thing. Really, all I want to do is tell time. And but I think in terms of the summer solstice, and I think of the 4th of July, and there are kind of parts of this season that I relate to. I often think of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Divinity School address, which is, where he's exhorting the would-be ministers of the time, get out of those whitewashed tombs and go be in nature. It was the last time he was invited to Harvard to deliver an address. I think of the Declaration of Independence and it being signed and what that means and who we are and what that says, and these incredible individuals that crafted such a radical experience and experiment that we're in. So there's just all kinds of stuff that just kind of rushes up with me, and I often ponder this this quote from Ernest Holmes, who is the founder of our particular denomination, because it reminds me of this time of year, and it seems to me so fitting that we talk about this idea of freedom or liberation. In his years ago, before he died, he wrote this manifesto of what he believed, and it was entitled "What I Believe." And then people of the church got a hold of it and made it "We Believe." And then all of a sudden, we have a creed, and I don't want to go there with that. But for him to respect. But one of the things that he talks about is he says the goal of each life is to be an emancipation from any condition whatsoever. That's the goal, the purpose of our life, the purpose of life itself is to experience a sense of emancipation. And how we experience this idea of emancipation is through the process of evolution. And I want to talk about that a little bit today, about how wherever we are is the sum of all of our experiences, as wherever anything is, and wherever as a nation, as a planet, or whatever it is, even a solar system or a galaxy or whatever, is the sum of all that was. And how we can emancipate ourselves from a static idea of what life is or what the divine is and where we go. But he writes this. Let me see if I can organize myself here. He writes this in the Science of Mind text. It's like one of the first things he says in here. He says, and I'm not going to try. I used to try to edit, the he's for theys and it's and all that. I'm not going to bother. He wrote this in 1938. This is how it was written in 1938. And if it's a challenge to you, Liz as a practitioner is here, Andrea here is a practitioner, Terry's a practitioner. They can pray with you over that because they're just words. But he writes this. He says, to suppose that the creative intelligence of the universe would create man or woman or dog or bird or whatever in bondage and leave them bound would be to dishonor the creative power which we call God. To suppose that God could make man as an individual without leaving him to discover himself would be to suppose an impossibility. Individuality must be spontaneous. It can never be automatic. The seed of freedom must be planted in the innermost being of man. But like the prodigal son, man must make the discovery for himself. In other words, the opportunity is there, but for us to have the experience, it's our own inner process, it's our own inner work that brings us to this place. So I had the notes of a talk that I was preparing to do on that very same theme, and then the events of last night happened and my notes went out the window. But this is kind of where I want to go with this thing. And it started with, I was thinking about living in Fallbrook, 2008, the first time I got evacuated. As many of you who lived in Fallbrook know what that experience is like, is you get a call, the city's on fire, the town's on fire, and you pack up and you go. I remember that, and I remember where I was and what was going on, and I remember there was a moment about a week and a half in, and it was really kind of interesting because what was going on is that, this is in 2008, is that we were communicating as a spiritual community of that time through things like Facebook and emails and things like that, and people were dispersed everywhere. But we were able to stay communicated with each other. And I remember as things were sort of somewhat clearing up, getting a call from my friend in San Diego, and he invited me. He says, why don't you get your dogs and come on down and spend some time at my house in San Diego? And I remember saying to him, Kevin, I just want to get home. I want to be with my community. I was longing to be here and to be in this community because there's something powerful about what it means to be living relationally, living in relationship, living in beingness itself. And where that takes me is this idea. I'm reading this really incredible book right now called The Disappearance of Ritual. But one of the things that he talks about is, several hundred years ago, the idea of freedom was radically different from what it is now. With the rise of sort of this idea of, the deification of individualism, of our own sense of who we are, and really what is worthy of... they're just going to keep calling me. I don't even know how to stop it. Where was I? I was going to Mexico. God, I'd love to go to Mexico. So, the idea of individualism with its own existential crisis of what that means and the crisis of meaning and purpose that brings wasn't existent then, because we live under the burden of this idea that freedom means absolutely being cut off from any kind of restraint. But in another time, freedom was really contingent on your community, because the community gave the freedom to flourish. The safety, the encouragement, the value, the things that are just kind of there. I think sometimes, in my own OCD mind, if I'm thinking about joining into something or connecting to something, and this happens a lot with people in relationships. We're always running these simulations in our mind. Well, what would happen if this happened? What would happen if this happened? And we're so busy in the simulation that we're not in the experience. And part of not being in the experience is predicated on this fear of doing it wrong. And I think that in itself, that whole idea finds its genesis, interesting word, in really bad theology. And I kind of want to play with that a little bit today. But before I get there, I want to think of something else here, and that is something else that has always stuck with me. And I thought about it because it's kind of its anniversary. June 20th, 1815. Y'all know where you were then? Sure, what life you were living or where things were. June 20th, 1815. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams had written a letter to Thomas Jefferson. Now, what's interesting about those two guys, and they're like two of my heroes, and you could not have been two different people. John Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, which later became Quincy, Massachusetts. He was a city boy. He was an attorney, and he grew up in that kind of family business kind of thing, and he was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was born on a plantation. He lived a very rural existence, and he was a staunch Republican, not the kind of Republican that we have today, but what was known as a Republican. And the two of them were friends and political rivals. Ponder that. They were friends and political rivals. They could barely agree on the color of ink that the founding documents were written on. And yet they were friends. Because there was a higher value, there was something else that was at work there. But anyway, John Adams writes this to Thomas Jefferson. The question before the human race is whether the God of nature shall govern the world by his own laws, or whether the priests and kings shall rule it by fictitious miracles. That is the question that stands before us then, as it stands before us today. The question before the human race is whether the God of nature shall govern the world by his own laws, or whether the priests and kings, the despots and tyrants, shall rule the world, and bad theologians, shall rule it by fictitious miracles. And, I think when we see the things that are going on today, when we see the slaughter that is Ukraine, when we see the genocide that is Gaza, when we see this needless attack in Iran where 400 innocent people were killed in a single blow and 3,000 people are injured, all of this, we can say that it is this idea and it's that idea, but let me tell you, it comes down to two words: bad theology. Bad theology of an idea of God that is unworthy of our love and attention. Because I think what has happened is, there has been, Alfred North Whitehead said this. He says, when the Christian or the followers of Jesus organized themselves as the Christian church and became part of the empire, they just took all that Caesar was and imposed it onto God, so that God became this sort of super Caesar, a Caesar that was nice. I'm a Tolkien freak, and I kind of see it in the sense, that Sauron wanted to remake the world and fix it a better way, to create this machine of what it was. Mahatma Gandhi said it this way: why is it only Christians who cannot see the nonviolence of Jesus? Why is it it's only the Christians that cannot see the nonviolence of Jesus? And so we find ourselves in this idea, and part of what I think is happening is that we developed this idea of a static God. And what I mean by a static God is this: a God that is unchanging, that is timeless, that is perfect. And so, how does one approach such a thing? Because no matter what you do it wrong. And you live in fear of it. And because we've imposed this whole idea, and by the way, again, what Ernest Holmes says is the God that we experience is the God of our perception. And if we have been conditioned to see a top-down mystical universe in which there is this unchanging, perfect thing, then we will begin to experience that, and we begin to organize our lives, our nations, our tribes, our families, our whole way of being around a perception. Years and years ago, I was in construction after I got out of college because I was 30, and of course, a 30 person who was a religious studies major, the next thing that you do is you become a carpenter, right? So, but I was working on this job site, and it was in Mission Valley, true story. And I've probably told it before because it's one of my favorite metaphors of life, but we were building this inner part of this building that we were building, and It was masonry that was being built. And it went up, and then what was going to happen is once the superstructure of the walls had been built around, they were going to lay the beam down, and then the beam would be where the roof would go, and the whole thing would go. Well, what happened is there was a day that the beam came in, this many $1,000 beam, and a crane, and all the workers and all these things came in, and it was measured twice, and it was measured, and they cut it, and they rose it up. They were lowering it down to where it was supposed to be, and it just started spinning. Because what had happened is the measurement had been taken at the bottom. And because of just simple geometry, it was wider at the top than it was at the bottom, that it didn't fit. It just didn't work because the math had been wrong. The perception, the building of it had been wrong. And so I think sometimes that's what's happening in the world today as we're trying to lower this beam on the superstructure of this world that we've created, but we're so off track from the very foundations of it, the natural laws of it. I am a busy man this morning. Harold Kushner writes it this way. He says, a God of power exhorts obedience, but cannot command love. A God who could spare the life of a dying child, who could prevent the earthquake but chooses not to, may inspire our fear and our calculated obedience, but does not deserve our love. This top-down idea and a theology that is based on that, and a political view that is surrounded by that or uses this thing, sure, it can invoke obedience and it can invoke fear, but it does not invoke love. So maybe if we settle ourselves down to the very foundations, we can begin to see that maybe what the mystics have been teaching all along is that the dynamic experience of this thing that we call God is not top-down, is not changeless, is not perfect, but is rather relational. That reaches out, that experiences, that learns, that is not omnipotent, is not omnipresent. Omnipresent, I'll give you that one. But everything else, no. That it is, and when we read, the holy writings for wherever they may be, okay, I'm not going to wear this watch anymore on Sundays because it's a busy. I've got a lot of moving parts of my life right now. But we find that this God is deeply relational. In fact, the word that we would use in the Hebrew Bible, it is a God who establishes relationship by covenant, agreement, relation. Rabbi Bradley Artson says it this way: covenant is always interactive, always connecting, and always relational. This is just like the cosmos at a quantum level. There are the very smallest level, there are no solid substances bouncing into each other. There are only probabilities, packets of energy, intertwined in their own uncertainty. And so, what if we began to perceive of this divine presence not so much on top dictating, but wherever we are inviting, wherever we are luring? What if it is impossible to do your life wrong? I'm not saying mistake-free. I'm a poster boy for that one. But what I'm saying is doing it wrong. Because if we begin to conceive of the universe from a quantum level, what we begin to see at this realm of infinite possibilities is that everything is the sum of the experiences that have happened in that moment. and that it is not written or prededicated what will happen next. For goodness sakes, look at how the cosmos, how the universe was created 14 point whatever billion years ago. You know, it was a cosmic soup. There were fluctuations, there were errors, there were abnormalities in this vast cosmic soup that caused different fluctuations in temperatures. Those things began to create the elements. Those things began to create matter. Those things began to create stars and planets and suns and all these infinite kinds of things, not because they were predetermined, but because that was how it shifted into that moment and shifted into that moment and shifted into that moment. It's like evolution as we experience. It is not predetermined. It is learning. It is dynamic. It is relational. Just like our bodies, we aren't just simply something here. We are a friggin' zoo. If you think about all the elements and all the things that are going on in our body and how they're reacting, how they're responding, and how they're interacting with each other, and then how that interacts with each and every other thing, and then we begin to see that our life is the sum of all the experiences of all the things that have happened, wherever it is. And that has brought us to you and I and each person into this room at this moment here. Not predetermined, but as a result. And in this result, this relational beingness, which is love, is present. And I think sometimes what happens is that we struggle with this idea because we struggle and think, well, how could God be this and how could God be that? God can be this and God can be that, just like you and I can be this or that. You can be a father and a son. You can be a mother and a daughter. You can be a physicist and an artist. There are elements, we are nuanced, we're far more complicated than one sort of static kind of thing. And that is because there is a natural law of how things are that is always responding, always luring, always inviting, always drawing to it to flourish. If you want to understand the nature of the divine, start a garden, take a walk, learn to surf, ride a horse. Get out of this and get into this, and we begin to see patterns and fluctuations and things. Indigenous people have understood this the whole time. Chief Seattle says it this way. He says, humankind has not woven the web of life, but we are one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. That's quantum reality. That's a relational universe. That is something that is perceived and experienced, that is not calculated and known. And that is where we are today. And so we find ourselves on this incredible brink of a crisis, an existential crisis in our planet today. And whether that crisis reveals itself as the degradation of the planet and how we have, taken a colonist mentality and looked at whatever is there for our personal gain, or whether it has been how we have colonized other countries for personal gain, or whether our economy is based on an idea of lack and reimbursement, or whatever the case may be, we are a mess. As a planet, as a species. Here we are. We are the sum of all these experiences, and yet, this is where the divine is present. Not because it orchestrated it, because that's just how love is. It's just always there. Whatever the moment is, there it is. Pouring itself, kenosis, pouring itself into the moment. Inviting, luring, calling forth, flourishing. We see it in nature all the time. And so our response then is how we align ourselves with flourishing, and let go of cumbersome ideas whose time has passed, and that maybe we all need a 12-step program for God. The 12th century Meister Eckhart says this. He says, in time, our greatest obstacle to God is our idea of God. And maybe we have outgrown an idea that no longer works, and maybe we can learn from indigenous cultures, maybe we can learn from quantum physics and science, maybe we can learn from our own intuition, our dreams, or whatever the case may be, or really smart people that are doing some really cool stuff. But maybe we have to admit that what we are perceiving and what we are experiencing is not leading us to life, but to death. And that maybe it's not so much that we can pretend that there's going to be some sort of technological miracle that's going to fix it for us, because it won't. And if you want to know why it won't, look at every technological miracle we've come up with and look how we've abused it. So maybe it's not coming from that. Maybe it's coming from a change in consciousness. And how we arrive at that change of consciousness is to align ourselves with this. Ernest Holmes says that prayer doesn't change God, it changes us. And when we align ourselves with flourishing and life and justice and mercy, then the invitation is there, and that becomes the sum of our experience. That becomes the cornerstone on which the superstructure is built, as St. Paul says, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, in all of us. And I offer you today a prayer from a Jesuit, of course, Father Sayed. Says it this way: God of mercy and compassion, of grace and reconciliation, pour your power upon all your children in the Middle East, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, Palestinians and Israelis. Let hatred be turned into love, fear to trust, despair to hope, oppression to freedom, occupation to liberation. The violent encounters may be replaced by loving embraces, and peace and justice could be experienced by all. So I just invite you to consider that prayer, and if it triggers something viscerally in your body, ask yourself why that is. Why that is. Dr. Holmes again says we see the condition on the outside and we heal it on the inside, and if this becomes a template, then we know our own path of personal healing. And if we are willing and courageous enough to take that healing, then we become a sum of possibility. And that sum of possibility becomes a safe place for freedom to flourish. Thank you.